Hallo zusammen und willkommen zurück auf dem Kanal. Heute reisen wir hoch in die nebligen Berge von Hunan, China, um den Bau einer der atemberaubendsten Fußgängerbrücken zu erleben, die je gebaut wurden. Die Zhangjiajie Glasbrücke. Auf den ersten Blick sieht sie fast unmöglich aus. Eine dünne weiße Linie zieht sich über eine gigantische Schlucht. Darunter gibt es keine Straße, keine Flussüberquerung, keinen festen Boden, nur einen erschreckenden Abgrund, treibende Nebel, senkrechte Felswände und einen weiten grünen Wald tief unten. Und mitten in dieser Landschaft steht eine Brücke mit einem transparenten Glasboden. Aber diese Brücke wurde nicht durch Magie gebaut. Sie wurde Schritt für Schritt mit technischer Präzision, extremem Mut und einem Bauprozess errichtet, der eine der schwierigsten natürlichen Umgebungen der Erde respektieren musste. Bevor das erste Stück Stahl gehoben wurde, mussten die Ingenieure die Schlucht selbst studieren. Der Zhangjiajie Grand Canyon ist keine flache Baustelle. Es ist eine dramatische Berglandschaft voller steiler Sandsteinfelsen, tiefer Täler, instabiler Kanten, Wind, Nebel und begrenztem Zugang. Jede Bewegung musste sorgfältig geplant werden. Jede Maschine, jeder Arbeiter, jedes Materialstück musste sicher die Felsränder erreichen. Die erste Phase war nicht glamourös. Es gab noch kein Glas, keine Touristen und noch keine berühmte Brücke. Die Arbeit begann mit der Vermessung, dem Markieren der Brückenachse, der Überprüfung der Gesteinsverhältnisse und der Vorbereitung beider Felskanten. Die Ingenieure mussten genau entscheiden, wo die Brücke das Land berühren, wo die Türme stehen und wo die massiven Seilkräfte im Berg verankert werden sollten. Dann kamen die Fundamente. Auf beiden Seiten der Schlucht hoben die Mannschaften die Baugruben für die kompakten Betonturmstützen aus und bereiteten sie vor. Diese Türme mögen nicht so massiv aussehen wie die Türme einer Autobahnbrücke, aber sie sind absolut entscheidend. Sie halten den Seilverlauf, führen das Hängesystem und leiten die Kräfte in den Boden ab. Die Arbeiter reinigten die Felsoberfläche, brachten Bewährungskörbe ein, gossen Beton und überprüften sorgfältig die Ausrichtung. Ein kleiner Fehler in dieser Phase könnte später die gesamte Brücke beeinträchtigen. Aber die wahre verborgene Kraft dieser Brücke liegt nicht nur in den Türmen. Sie liegt in den Verankerungen. Hinter den Türmen schufen die Ingenieure die Systeme, die dem enormen Zug der Haupttragseile widerstehen sollten. Auf einer Seite wurde eine Tunnelverankerung in den Fels gehauen. Auf der anderen Seite wurde eine schwere Schwerkraftverankerung am Felsrand errichtet. Diese Teile sind den Besuchern größtenteils verborgen, aber sie gehören zu den wichtigsten Elementen der gesamten Brücke. Ohne starke Verankerungen kann die Brücke nicht existieren. Nachdem die Fundamente und Verankerungen fertig waren, begannen die kompakten Betontürme zu wachsen. Nicht auf einmal, sondern Abschnitt für Abschnitt. Die Bewehrung wurde verlängert. Die Schalung wurde installiert. Beton wurde gegossen. Jeder Turm wurde ausgeschalt, nachbehandelt, inspiziert und erneut überprüft. Langsam erschienen 4 Turmschäfte an den beiden gegenüberliegenden Felsrändern und standen wie stille Wächter der Schlucht. The men who stood on those newly completed towers felt the wind tear at their clothes and saw the chasm yawn below, a void that had never been crossed by anything but birds and clouds and the echo of the river's distant roar. Up on those steel summits, the saddle mountings gleamed in the alpine light, immense curved cradles of steel, polished to an almost surgical smoothness, designed not merely to hold the great cables but to receive them with a kind of mechanical grace, allowing them to glide over the tower tops and descend at precisely calculated angles into the rock on either side. These saddles were the silent turnstiles of the future bridge, the points where vertical load would become horizontal tension, where the weight of everything yet to come would be gathered and redirected into the bones of the earth itself. Workers with theodolites and fine adjustment screws spent weeks aligning them, for an error of a single degree at the saddle would become a catastrophic deviation a mile away in the anchorage chamber. The steel was cold to the touch even in summer, and it bore the smell of machine oil and the faint metallic tang that clings to all great engineered things before the weather claims them. When the saddles were finally bolted and grouted into their final positions, they seemed almost like living creatures perched on the stone, patient, silent, waiting to fulfill their singular purpose. Then came the moment that had existed only in drawings and calculations and the anxious dreams of the engineers, the crossing of the first line. It is difficult now, with the completed bridge so familiar in photographs and memory, to reconstruct the sheer audacity of what that required. On one side of the gorge stood a spool of thin wire rope, no thicker than a man's little finger, coiled on a drum with the quiet potential of a sleeping snake. On the other side, 1,000, 2,000 feet away, depending on the crossing, there was nothing but rock and scrub and the tiny figures of the receiving crew. Between them lay empty air. How does a line cross emptiness when there is nothing to carry it? The engineers had considered many methods: a rocket with a thin line attached, fired from one cliff to the other, a small boat struggling across the white water far below, paying out line as it went, a kite flown on the updrafts that boiled up from the canyon walls. Each method had its advocates and its dangers. What was finally attempted depended on the terrain and the wind and the desperate calculus of acceptable risk. In some accounts, it was a volunteer who climbed down one cliff face, crossed the water on a makeshift raft or a swaying footbridge of ropes, and then scaled the opposite wall with the pilot line tied to his waist, a journey of hours through loose rock and thorny brush, every handhold a decision between life and the long fall. In other versions, a heavy arrow or a small rocket trailing a silk thread was fired across, the thread fluttering in the updrafts like a spider's gossamer, so fragile that a gust of wind could snap it and erase the attempt. And in still other tellings, it was simply a man with a keen eye and a coiled line who threw a weighted end and watched it arc out over the abyss, hoping the receiver on the far side would catch it before it fell. Whatever the method, the moment of connection was almost unbearably charged. The thin line came to rest on the far rim, was caught by gloved hands, was pulled taut for the first time. It sagged under its own small weight, a delicate catenary curve drawn against the blank page of the sky. The men on both sides held their breath as the line was tested with a gentle pull, then a firmer one. It held. It was nothing to look at, a glint in the sunlight, a thread scarcely visible from the canyon floor, but it was the first material link between the two sides, the first time in the history of the world that a continuous object spanned that particular void. That night, some of the engineers did not sleep. They lay awake thinking about that slender line sagging alone in the darkness, vibrating in the wind, the entire project now dependent on its fragile integrity. If it snapped, they would have to begin again. But it did not snap. With the pilot line secure, the real work of escalation began. A winch on one side began to pull, and the pilot line dragged behind it the next cable in the sequence, a stronger pulling line, thicker and heavier, its weight making the original thread groan and sing with tension. The pulling line advanced inch by inch across the gorge, the winch operator watching the tension gauge with the concentration of a surgeon, for too much strain would snap the pilot line and too little would let the pulling line sag into the abyss and tangle in the rocks below. When the pulling line was in place, it was used to haul the first messenger cable, and the messenger cable in turn hauled the hauling rope, each successive line thicker and stronger than the last, a chain of increasing capacity building toward the ultimate price. The process was agonizingly slow. Every splice had to be inspected, every pulley checked for friction, every foot of the crossing monitored for signs of wear or twisting. The cables crept across the void like living things, their movement almost imperceptible at a distance, their weight bowing them into enormous curves that swayed with the wind and the changing temperature of the day. In the morning cold, the lines were shorter and tighter, in the afternoon heat, they expanded and sagged closer to the distant river, and the tension had to be adjusted constantly. Men worked through the nights in shifts, their lanterns tiny sparks on the dark rims, the cables invisible against the stars. And then, at last, came the day of the first main cable. This was not a wire but a bundle of wires, a great cylindrical mass of galvanized steel strands that would eventually be compacted into a solid unit, but for now it was a growing organism fed strand by strand from spinning wheels that traveled back and forth across the Spanish. The method was ancient in its essentials, perfected by John Roebling and his sons, but it never lost its power to awe those who witnessed it. A grooved sheep suspended from a continuous loop of hauling rope, carried a single strand of wire from one anchorage, up over the saddles, and down to the other anchorage in an endless loop. Each trip took minutes, and each strand was laid beside its neighbors with a precision that allowed for perfect compaction later. The men who guided the spinning wheels were known for their nerve and their indifference to the void beneath them, for they worked not from a completed deck but from temporary footbridges or, in the earliest stages, from the catwalks that would later be built. They rode the spinning wheels themselves sometimes, hanging from the traveling sheaves, their legs dangling over nothing, their hands adjusting the tension of the wire as they moved. The wire paid out from reels on the anchorage floor, and as each strand settled into its place in the saddle grooves, the great cable began to take shape, at first a loose collection of individual wires that chimed against each other in the wind, then a denser and denser aggregation as the weeks went by, until it resembled a great dormant serpent coiled over the towers and buried in the living rock. When the first main cable was complete and the second was well underway, the catwalk was built. It was a marvel of temporary engineering in its own right, a narrow suspended pathway of wire mesh and wooden slats that hung beneath the main cables and gave the workers their first continuous walking surface across the full Spanish. Erecting it required men to climb along the main cables themselves, clipping carabiners to the strands, leaning out into the void to attach the vertical suspender ropes that would hold the catwalk. They worked in wind that could knock a man sideways, in fog that reduced visibility to arm's length, in the relentless sun of high altitudes that burned exposed skin and made the metal too hot to touch with bare hands. The catwalk swayed and bounced underfoot, a sensation that took weeks to grow accustomed to, and some men never did. They worked with their jaws clenched and their eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look down through the mesh at the river reduced to a silver thread thousands of feet below. From this precarious platform, the real bridge began to emerge. The cable bands, heavy steel clamps that would grip the main cables and provide attachment points for the vertical suspender ropes, were lowered into position by small derricks that crawled along the catwalk. Each band had to be tightened to a specific torque, for if it slipped under load, the geometry of the entire suspension system would be compromised. The men used wrenches as long as their arms, straining against the bolts in a rhythmic dance of tightening and measuring, until every band was locked in place with a grip that would hold against the weight of decades. Then the suspender ropes were hung, one after another, descending from the cable bands like the strings of a giant harp. Each rope was a carefully calculated length, for the deck they would eventually carry had to be perfectly level despite the curve of the main cables above it. The ropes hung limp at first, their lower ends swinging free in the breeze, a forest of vertical lines that seemed to await some signal to come to life. As the number of suspenders grew, the pattern became visible from the canyon rims, a precise geometric grid of verticals and catenaries, a sketch in 3 dimensions of the bridge that was yet to exist. Tourists and journalists who visited the site at this stage often remarked on the strangeness of the scene, the towers standing complete and proud, the great cables sweeping from anchorage to anchorage, the catwalks slung beneath them, the suspenders hanging in their hundreds, and still, impossibly, no deck. The bridge was all frame and no picture, all skeleton and no flesh, a promise written in steel across the sky. It was beautiful in its incompleteness, and it was terrifying, for it revealed with total honesty the delicate balance of forces that a finished bridge conceals beneath its roadway. Every part was visible, every load path exposed, the entire stately logic of the suspension principle laid bare for anyone with eyes to see. And yet for all this visible progress, the most critical work was happening out of sight, deep inside the mountains on either shore. The anchorages were the hidden counterweights to everything that rose above the canyon, and their construction was a saga of its own. The main cables did not simply end at the surface, they plunged into tunnels or massive concrete chambers excavated into the bedrock, where they were splayed out into individual strands and anchored to steel eye-bars or grouted sockets embedded in the stone. The splayed chambers were cathedrals of engineering, vast underground voids where the bundled wires of the main cable separated like the roots of a tree and were secured in a radiating fan pattern. The concrete used in these chambers was poured in continuous shifts that lasted for days, for any cold joint or interruption could create a weakness that might, decades later, allow water to seep in and corrode the steel. The rock around the anchorages was tested and retested, drilled and injected with grout to fill every fissure, until the engineers were satisfied that the mountain itself would hold against the immense pull of the cables. That pull, once the full weight of the deck was applied, would amount to many thousands of tons, a force so great that it could crush inadequately designed concrete or shear through weak rock. The anchorages had to be immovable, and they were. They were the silent partners in the bridge's performance, the buried fists that gripped the earth while the cables and towers did their visible work in the light. Back on the catwalk, the installation of the suspender ropes continued day after day, in all weather, through the seasons. The men who did this work developed a strange intimacy with the void. They learned to read the wind, to predict the sudden gusts that funneled through the canyon, to move with the rhythm of the catwalk's sway rather than against it, threading pins through steel ice with fingers that were numb with cold or slick with sweat, depending on the altitude and the hour. They sang to pass the time, and their songs echoed off the canyon walls and were swallowed by the immense silence that surrounded them. They ate their lunches sitting on the catwalk with their legs dangling over the edge, bread and cheese and strong tea from thermos flasks, looking out at a view that no one on earth had ever seen from this vantage point. They were building the bridge, but they were also becoming part of its mythology, these men in their heavy boots and their hard hats, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hands calloused from the wire and the steel. Every suspender that was hung brought the project one step closer to the day when the deck sections would begin to arrive, when the empty harp would finally be strung with the solid mass of the roadway, when the bridge would cease to be a drawing in the air and become a thing that could be crossed. But for now, in this suspended moment between the completion of the cables and the arrival of the deck, the bridge existed in a state of pure potential, a work of art waiting for its final element. A question posed to the sky whose answer was still being fabricated in distant mills and workshops. The two graceful cable lines that spanned the heavens were no longer alone, they were adorned with their vertical attendants, their geometry growing more complex by the day, but they still awaited the weight that would justify their existence, the load that would transform them from an elegant abstraction into one of the great load-bearing structures of the world. Dann begann die Brücke endlich Gestalt anzunehmen. Stählerne Decksegmente wurden gehoben und unter den Hängerseilen verbunden. Randträger wurden installiert. Querträger wurden verschraubt. Das schlanke Skelett der Brücke streckte sich vom Rand aus, dann über die Mitte und verband sich schließlich mit der gegenüberliegenden Seite. In diesem Stadium war die Brücke sichtbar, aber noch nicht vollständig. Der berühmteste Teil fehlte noch: der Glasboden. Bevor das Glas installiert werden konnte, brachten die Arbeiter die rechteckigen Tragrahmen, Schwingungsdämpfer, Überwachungssensoren und verdeckten Leitungen an. Die Brücke musste mehr als schön sein. Sie musste sicher, stabil und sorgfältig überwacht sein. Dann kamen die Glasplatten. Jede Verbundglasplatte wurde mit speziellen Sauggeräten gehoben, in ihren exakten Rahmen abgesenkt, auf Gummidichtungen gesetzt, geklemmt, nivelliert und inspiziert. Platte für Platte verwandelte sich das leere Stahlgitter in einen transparenten Gehweg. Für die Arbeiter war dies ein heikler Ingenieureinsatz. Für zukünftige Besucher sollte es eine atemberaubende Erfahrung werden. Nach dem Glas kamen die Geländer. Die offenen Stahlgeländer wurden entlang beider Seiten des Decks installiert und gaben der Brücke ihre endgültige Fußgängersicherheitsform. Eingangsplattformen wurden an beiden Felsrändern fertiggestellt. Temporäre Bausysteme wurden entfernt. Die Brücke wurde gereinigt, poliert und für die Prüfung vorbereitet. Aber keine große Brücke öffnet nur, weil sie fertig aussieht. Zuerst kamen die Inspektionen. Ingenieure überprüften die Seile, Hänger, Sättel, Verankerungen, Glasklemmen, Sensoren, Dämpfer, Geländer und Deckverbindungen. Dann kamen statische Belastungstests mit kontrollierten Gewichten. Danach überprüften dynamische G-Tests, wie die Brücke auf Bewegung, Vibration und echten Fußgängerverkehr reagierte. Erst nach Bestehen dieser Tests konnte die Glasbrücke zu dem werden, was die Welt heute kennt, eine unvergessliche Glasbodenbrücke, hoch über einer der spektakulärsten Schluchten Chinas. Und als die ersten Besucher endlich den transparenten Boden betraten, fügte sich die gesamte Baugeschichte zusammen. Die verborgenen Fundamente, die Felsverankerungen, die Betontürme, die Stahlsättel, die Hauptseile, die Hänger, der Deckrahmen, die Glasplatten, die Geländer, die Tests. Alles musste in der richtigen Reihenfolge geschehen. Das macht diese Brücke so erstaunlich. Sie ist nicht nur eine Touristenattraktion. Sie ist ein Meisterwerk der Bergbautechnik. Gebaut an einem Ort, an dem schon das Stehen am Rand der Klippe beängstigend wirken kann. Von oben sieht die fertige Brücke elegant und fast schwerelos aus. Aber hinter dieser Eleganz steckt ein Bauprozess voller Gefahr, Präzision und unglaublichem menschlichem Einsatz. Wenn Sie also das nächste Mal Menschen über die Zhangjiajie Glasbrücke gehen sehen, denken Sie daran, Sie gehen nicht nur auf Glas. Sie gehen auf jahrelange Ingenieurarbeit, versteckt in den Klippen, gespannt durch Seile und aufgehängt über einer der dramatischsten Landschaften der Erde. Wenn Ihnen diese Baureise gefallen hat, vergessen Sie nicht, das Video zu liken, den Kanal zu abonnieren und die Benachrichtigungsglocke zu aktivieren, damit Sie die nächste unglaubliche Ingenieursgeschichte nicht verpassen. Vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen und wir sehen uns im nächsten Video.